Alright, so let's look at one of the three sentences from that top row and the bottom row sentence. And what we're thinking about, remember, are what's the truth functional interaction, and do we have universal control over either of the points of interaction, and if so, which one? So we look and we say, okay, we do have truth functional interaction here with the instances if the variables match, because not f blah and f blah on the left disjunct would let us do MTP. So now we need to ask, do we have universal control over either the not FO or the FX? And indeed we do. On the top we don't, but in the bottom we have for all x, and that controls the FX. So we do indeed have universal control over one of the points of sentential interaction. And so in this case, we can indeed instantiate in a way where we're going to be able to apply MTP. And it's going to go like this. So first we instantiate the, so we put in the two lines, and then we're going to apply EI first to some O not FO, and then we have to do the EI first, right, because that's always to a new variable. Then we do the UI to the same thing, so that we're going to get MTP once we clear off the existential. And then we would EI the sum y to j. Now at this point, if you're following the sort of literal old instructions, you'd have to go back to line 2 and instantiate the universal to j. We don't want to do that. We want to do MTP instead. And we get gj. And we don't worry about doing ui to j. Maybe at some point we will need to go back and do ui, the for all x to fx to j for some reason. Maybe. Who knows? Right now we don't know. It's possible. But to make the interaction run, we don't worry about instantiating the for all x to j, and indeed, basically we're only instantiating the j so that we can make an interaction happen with the not fi and fi. Of course, we're going to use gj probably, and so we may care about j, but initially we're just focused on the I, and the fact that it's to j, we just don't care about that right now. Okay, let's consider another example. So some z not gz, and for all x fx, or all x some y fx or gy. So if we look at the where the sentential interaction is going to be, it's going to be on the g's, the not gz and the gy. And if we look where the universal where we have the universal point of control, we have a universal control over the fx, but the gy is controlled by an existential y, so it's some y gy. So there's no interaction here. We don't have universal control over either point of interaction, so we're never going to be able to make some z not gz, and for all x some y fx or gy interact, because whichever of those existential quantifiers we instantiate first, the other one's going to be to something else. So we're always going to have like not gi and then fi or gj, or we're going to have fx or gi and then not gj. The not g blah, we're going to have a not g and then a variable, and we're also going to have f whatever or g something, and the variable in the next to the g in the disjunction and the variable in the not g from the first sentence are always going to be different variables because they're both bound by existentials, and so they will never interact. So we don't want to try and make them interact. That would be fruitless. So we need to approach this interaction carefully. We see that, okay, there are those two sentences we have. We need to instantiate the existential y before we instantiate the universal s. And so we first instantiate the universal x to expose the existential y. And then we instantiate the existential y to a new variable. And only then do we go back to line 1 and instantiate it to I so that we can then do MTP. If we did the for all s first, then when we got to the sum y, that would be to a new variable. And so we'd have, you know, gx, or we'd have not gx and then gi or something like that. The variables wouldn't match. So you have to make sure when you're setting up one of these interactions, you need to make sure do the EI first, and that's going to require thinking about, well, which one do I want to do first? So how can we put this together? When you're thinking forward, when you're proceeding from lines to get a contradiction, you want to ask which variables do you control, and where are the the truth functional interactions, and then given that, you decide how to proceed to instantiate so that you can make your instances interact with your propositional rules. Now I want to give an example of doing a derivation in this way. So here's derivation 3.304. So we want to show the conclusion. Now, since we're trying to show a negation, we're going to make an indirect assumption to clear off this negation. So here, this is a fairly straightforward case of the sort of reasoning we're going to be doing. So if we look at this, though, we see, okay, we have for all x some y, fy, and not fx. So if we can get this and this, split them off, and they have the same variable in them, then we're going to be good to go. So that's, in this case, that's the truth functional interaction we're thinking about. We just want to have the same variable in the f and the not f. So we instantiate the universal to, let's say, x. It doesn't matter. And then when we do because there are no free variables yet, so it doesn't matter what what the UI goes to. Now with 3, we have to do it to a new variable. So here, now we're stuck. Well, no, so what am I talking about? We're not stuck, but 5 and 6 don't contradict each other. We have fi and not fx. Okay, so now we need to go back, and we need to instantiate again, and instantiate the universal again, or the universal and the existential, so that we can get a contradiction. So this is, again, an example of thinking about how these contradiction works. And we have to decide, do we want to instantiate the universal to x, or do we want to instantiate it to I? So if we look here, we have fi and we have not fx. And we see the universal controls the not f, and the existential controls the f. So when we instantiate the universal, we're going to get a not f something, right? And we want that to contradict what we already have. We have fi and we have not fx. So when we instantiate the universal, we're going to have a not f something, and so the contradiction is going to be with an f something. Okay, so that means if we instantiate the universal to x, we're going to get not fx again, and that's not going to contradict this. But if we instantiate the universal to I, we're going to get not fi, which will contradict that. So the sentential interaction we're interested in is contradiction, and the quantifier that controls, the universal quantifier controls the not side, so we need to instantiate in a way that will contradict the unnegated one, and that means we have to instantiate to I. So we'll say 2 ui to I. Now we're going to ei to j to clear off the extra quantifier, and we split off the right-hand side. And now we have 5, 9 id. Okay, so that's a way of thinking about where it's a sort of a simple way of watching, okay, we're going to instantiate this to get sentential interactions with these, and we have to decide, well, the universal, what do we want to instantiate the universal to in order to get a sentential interaction? And the sentential interaction is contradiction. So we want to instantiate the universal in a way that we're going to get a contradiction. So what do we instantiate it to? Well, it controls a not f, so we need to get a contradiction with an f. We have fi, that means this needs to go to not fi. So there's an example. And we'll look at one more problem that's like this. This one's a little bit more difficult. Okay, so we want to show some x, fx, and gx. So we might think, okay, we'll assume id qm, and then we'll bring in our premise. Okay. Now, to think about how this is going to work is a little bit tricky. We need to realize that this is going to turn into, with De Morgan's, we can see what happens. It's going to turn into a disjunction with negated disjuncts. And so we're going to do MTP with it. We probably want to do MTP with what we get with the existential here. So first we'll do 3 ui to x and then ei to I. Now we can instantiate this in either way. We can instantiate it so that it goes to the I or to the x. And in this case, what's going to happen is we're going to get, let's see what happens. no, sorry. So with either of these, we're going to be able to do MTP. We can instantiate 2 to x, and we can also instantiate 2 to I. Okay. Now, we can do MTP with either of these. So we can do 5, 8 MTP, because we have not FI, and that gives us not GI. And we can do 6, 7 MTP, and we get not FX. Now, then we need to think, okay, so which one's going to be the useful one? Well, again, we want to get a contradiction, and we're going to presumably get a contradiction out of this conjunction of Fy and Gx. Well, what's the easiest place to get a contradiction? Well, again, we want to think about interaction. So, in this case, we have existential control over the y here, because it's some y. We have universal control over the gx. So that means when we look down here, we see we have not gi and we have not fx. That means we want to instantiate the universal to I, because now this gi is going to contradict that not gi, and we can instantiate that again to j, and we can split off the right side, and we have a contradiction between 9 and 13. So here, when we do this these two UIs from line 2, we have to decide if we're going to UI to X or to I. And in general, the reason why we choose to do the UI to I is the useful one, because we're going to end up with the variable that's when we use the i's here, then we end up with something that's controlled by, that interacts with what's controlled by this universal quantifier. And that's what happens down here. We instantiate this universal quantifier again to I, so that this not gi can interact with it, and contradicting it. So the reason why the I is useful, the UI to I is useful, and the UI to X is not so useful, is because what we're going to get out after we do the UI to X and the UI to I, and we get these two things, the not GI is useful and the not FX is not useful. Why? Because the not GI, so if we look at line 3, what we have, this this stuff, the useful one here, is going to interact with what this universal quantifier controls. And what this universal quantifier controls is the gx, and it's the I that figures in the g. So the reason why this universal, we don't actually care about this line or this line, right? It's all still okay. And that means it's the UI to, when we UI line 2, what we're interested in is the UI to I. The reason why is because that then gives us something that interacts with the gx, and the gx is what's controlled by the universal quantifier. So again, you want to be thinking about what's controlled by universal quantifiers, and I want what I'm currently working with to interact with what I can get from universal instantiation. So there's another different strategy for working on these cycling problems that I'll be talking about next week. But for now, this should get you going with the cycling problems that you will have for this next coming derivation homework. So good luck.